I'm delighted to welcome the Honourable Tim Watts, Member of Parliament and the Australian Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs to this particular event we are hosting in honour of his visit to Delhi. And we're also using this occasion to release our Foreign Policy Survey. Since it is Young India's views on foreign policy, and I know that the Honourable Minister is engaged with young minds in his own country and elsewhere, I thought this would be a good occasion to speak to him on some aspects of the survey, but also on how Australia is changing. He's someone who is a politician, someone who is a thinker, someone who's an author. And I highly recommend his book, Golden Australia, the changing identity of that continent, that country. And certainly that's something that we will be discussing as well. Now, of course, the minister holds a degree in law. He has a MPP from Monash University. And he's also someone who studied at the London School of Economics, done his Masters of Science in Politics and Communication, where one of the rowdy backbenchers in the classroom happened to be me. Before entering Parliament, he has also worked in the technology sector at Telstra, I'm told, and of course also in law offices advising folks on matters of policy and business. He has served in a wide range of roles, and most importantly, he has been engaging with the technology sector quite intensely. He was the Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity and Communications, and in his new role, tech diplomacy, digital diplomacy, and connecting the world on matters digital are going to be one of his key concerns, and I'm happy to welcome Tobias Feakin, Ambassador for Cyber Affairs Australia, who joined us this afternoon. Now, throughout his time in Parliament, the Minister has been an active participant in Track 1.5 dialogues. Most noticeably, he was very active in the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. And we have some folks from that dialogue here as well, and I'm going to probably bring them into the conversation to speak to you. And of course, Minister, our survey tells us that amongst the breakout nations and the breakout relationships, Australia happens to be the most notable as far as Indian foreign policy and young India is concerned. Ambassador Gotra, who's here this evening with us, would remember 10 years ago, we were finding ways of talking to each other. It was quite difficult. We were at a stage when we had to really muster up all creativity to find ways of being cordial to each other. And today we see in survey after survey, in our meetings, in our partnership on key questions and key areas, that we happen to be more often on the same side, more often wearing the same colors in terms of the boxing ring. And therefore, this remarkable transformation of the last decade in our partnership also, as reflected in our survey, makes you, Honourable Minister, the right person to speak to us on this occasion. So let me invite you to deliver your oration on the future of diplomacy, and then you can join me on stage for a conversation thereafter. So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction, Samir. I was thinking while listening to you speak there that the first time Samir and I met was very briefly after I was first appointed to the Ministry in Foreign Affairs after the election of the Albanese government. We had a outstanding conversation, and I thought it was exactly the kind of conversation you want to have when you're setting out in a new role. Big picture thinking, challenging provocations, starting the way that you want to continue in a role. So at that dinner, I said to Samir, I would be in India shortly in a formal role, and here I am. And I was reflecting in the audience that the first time I came to India was, I think I was 21, 22. I came to Mumbai because I wanted to see the Maidan where Sachin Tendulkar played, and I booked a room for a week in Mumbai, very cheap, not anywhere near as salubrious as the room we're in today. But that is for the first time I fell in love with India. It's just so much going on in this country. It was just overwhelming, a sensory overload to a young Australian in a very big city. So I'm delighted to be here in India for my first official visit in my role as Australia's Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, and particularly to discuss the future of diplomacy. I'll offer a few thoughts briefly on this before we engage in another wonderful conversation on the podium here today. But before I start, I'd like to just congratulate ORF on the release of its second Foreign Policy Survey, which plays an important role in capturing the mood of India's young urban citizens towards foreign policy. I can say firsthand that it's a survey that Australian foreign policy makers have read with great interest. It's made a very important contribution, and it makes this evening's conversation especially apt. Because when we talk about the future of diplomacy, it only makes sense to consider the cohort that will shape this future. Understanding what matters to younger demographics matters to our understanding of how nations and regions will evolve over future years. The institutions and instruments of our international politics and statecraft are, how should we put it, more often the domains of more established figures in our foreign policy circles. And as a result, the perspectives and experiences of younger people are all too easily overlooked in these spheres. But the reality is that our younger generations are already pushing the frontiers of modern diplomacy on their own. It's the establishment that needs to catch up. The ORF's 2022 Foreign Policy Survey identified climate change as the main concern for India's youth, with almost 84% naming climate change as their challenge of greatest concern. And attitudes amongst younger Australian cohorts are strikingly similar. The Australia Institute's Climate of the Nation poll, also released this month, found that 84% of 25 to 34-year-old Australians were similarly concerned about climate change. The ORF survey also highlighted Australia and India's common ground. In total, 60% of your respondents identified Australia as India's first or second preferred partner in the Indo-Pacific. That's a finding that gave me great personal pleasure. As a Member of Parliament in Western Melbourne, I represent some of the most strikingly diverse constituencies in Australia. 2/3 of my constituents are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas, and fully 10% of my voters were born in India. Many of them the young, vibrant, energetic, influential people that will shape the future of the Australia-India relationship. And a finding that stood out to me was that India's young people saw Australia as second only to the United States, as very likely or somewhat likely to become a leading partner for India over the next decade. As Samir was saying, the relationship has come an extraordinary distance in the last 10 years. On my visit here to New Delhi and previously to Bengaluru earlier in this trip, I've been struck at just how natural my meetings have been with Indian political figures, with stakeholders from the government. You know, it's a relationship of intimacy, of friendship. These are meetings that are not difficult. You know, we're not struggling for conversation. The conversations are bubbling over. So the finding in the ORF report stands out because India's youth are spot on. India and Australia are natural partners in the future in the region. Australia and India have a shared understanding that, as our Foreign Minister Penny Wong have put it, amidst the economic and geopolitical reshaping that is sweeping our region, we know that this period of change is best navigated together. The youth of today have found new and innovative ways to give voice to their concerns and are leading consequential political movements the world over, on climate change, on gun violence, on sexual discrimination and on economic inequality. And they bring to this advocacy a digital connectedness that earlier generations did not. They've shown that to communicate effectively in a modern environment to new audiences requires new skills and new capabilities. To maintain influence and to ensure diplomacy evolves with the times, we need to rethink the tools of our diplomatic engagement. We have to ask ourselves the question, do we have the right skills and the right people to support effective and influential forms of diplomacy? This is a question that I've been asked as Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, and it's something that the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is currently conducting a 10-year capability review, is asking too. I was struck by this recently, by the changing way that we engage with the rest of the world, when my friend Sam Lim gave his first speech in our Parliament. Sam's speech was deeply moving and painted Australia in all of its modern diversity, showing how a third-generation Malaysian Chinese man became a Member of Parliament 20 years after migrating here and a few years after becoming the Policeman of the Year in Western Australia. So as projecting modern Australia to the world is a new priority of the Albanese Labor government, I tweeted out a grab of Sam giving his thank yous to all of the people that made it possible for him to be in Parliament. Thank yous that he gave in English, Mandarin, Malay and Hokkien. Within 24 hours, I was having a conversation through this tweet with thousands of Malaysians, including Malaysia's Prime Minister, who personally called Sam after the speech. The video had been retweeted thousands of times and was viewed 1.2 million times. Through social media, through just a brief grab, I projected modern, diverse Australia and our more representative 47th Parliament to a global audience. Australian MPs are now very familiar with the flood of engagement on social media that follows from engaging with significant Indian figures on social media platforms. A few months ago, I went to the Indian Film Festival of Melbourne, which is the biggest annual Indian film festival outside of India every year. And to top off a fantastic evening there, I was papped on the red carpet coming in with Bollywood superstar Abhishek Bachchan, and was retweeted by the man himself, introducing me to his 15.5 million followers, somewhat more than I have on my account. I've been similarly struck by the digital and dynamic approach of Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar when he engages with the world. I recently watched on with much enthusiasm as he distilled an action-packed 11-day visit to the US, including his 50-something bilateral engagements at the 77th United Nations General Assembly, into a pithy 2-minute video. As he set out to advance India's interests abroad, he gave those back home an opportunity to come along on the journey and the rest of the world a front row seat. So increasingly, digital engagement and literacy is crucial to how we engage with the world. I've seen it too in the way that my friend and fellow AIYD alumni, shout out to the AIYD alumni in the room, hands up, hi, couple, awesome. When I did AIYD in New Delhi, just down the road, one of my co-participants was Harsh Sanghavi, who we were comparing notes on about the task of being young politicians in our respective systems. I followed his very significant progress very closely since then, and the way that he engages on social media is an extraordinary model, I think, for how an elected representative can connect directly with their constituents. Although again, Harsh has somewhat more constituents than I have in Australia. So bringing young Indians and Australians, born digital natives, into our foreign policy is vital to how we reach out and engage with our region and the world around us. It's vital to that crucial task of foreign policy of influencing and shaping the regions that we live in. Because we all know that our younger demographics are on the front lines of digital engagement, and we all need the fresh, new thinking that they provide our systems. Doing this requires a tech savviness, a creativity, a willingness to engage sensibly with risk, and an acknowledgement that we won't always get it right. But the alternative to not engaging in these new platforms is to not be heard at all and to not affect influence at all. And this is a challenge that I'm looking forward to engaging with in full flight. So thank you for welcoming me here today. It's a great pleasure to be back here again with New Delhi. And it's an even greater pleasure to be ready to sit down to have another conversation with Samir Saran. Thank you.
Great. So I know you have a hard stop at 6. I'm going to try and stick to that. But let's pose a few questions to you, Minister, and then invite our audiences to join us as well. I thought we should start with your book, The Golden Country, where you are engaging with the changing Australian identity. So the first question for you, which in a sense allows us to explore your own appreciation of what is happening, is perhaps to discuss what is the single most profound change that is happening in terms of Australian identity. What has the Australian experience with diversity been? How are the South Asians changing Australia's character? And of course, from a white country, as you mentioned in your book, what is Australia becoming today? And what does it really mean in terms of your foreign policy choices? How is the diaspora, folks from different spaces and places, going to change and implicate your thinking in the days ahead?
So in a word, Samir, I'd say migration. So when I was born, around 2% of the Australian population have an Asian heritage of some kind. And that was really a function out of, when Australia federated, we had an explicit white Australia policy. Our immigration policy was racially discriminatory. It was the case for many decades. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. I speak openly about it, though, because it's a terrible mistake that our democratic system recognised and changed. And over the last 20 years, Australia's had one of the highest immigration rates in the OECD. And really in a generation, our country has transformed. Now, Asian Australians as a group collectively represent somewhere, depending on how you measure it, between 17 and 18% of the Australian population. It's a bigger minority group than, say, African Americans in the US or Hispanic Americans in the US. And that's really transformed the nature of our country. I mean, the best way to see that was at the first game of the T20 World Cup recently, the India-Pakistan game, and what a game it was. But to see the MCG bursting at the seams with supporters there, Australians, I should say, really showed me that through migration, Melbourne is now one of the great Indian cities of the world, I think. And my electorate, as I said earlier, around 10% of my constituency was born in India. Around 1 million Australians born in India. 1 million Australians claim Indian heritage. 7 lakh born in India. This has really happened in a short period of time. It's really transformed the way that we think of what it means to be Australian. But importantly, it's connected us with the whole region in a way that's radically different than was the case in the past. And there's a real intimacy in our connection with the region now.
So, I would really like to also understand from you, what does it mean in terms of those who consider themselves the original inhabitants? And how does that play out? Or is it a country where there is no original inhabitant and we are all migrants?
I'm really pleased you raised that, Samir, because Australian identity is complex. Noel Pearson, one of our great Indigenous leaders, gave a speech a couple of years ago that I think really nails it. He says that you can't tell the one story of Australia without telling 3 stories. The story of our tens of thousands of years of continuous Indigenous culture, something that's very precious to Australians and particularly to our new government. The Westminster institutions that were built on top of it, the second story of Australia. And then thirdly, the story of the multicultural migration that has so enriched our nation in recent decades. So Noel Pearson, an Indigenous leader, his proposition was that if you try to tell the story of Australian identity leaving out one of those 3 stories, it's incomplete. But the important thing is that those 3 stories together tell one story. They bind us together in one story of what it means to be Australian.
So this nicely leads me into my next question. Digital Australia. Now, in my recent visit to Australia, I was told digital is generally a positive attribute to Australia's experience. You Americans and you Indians, you have baggages of history, and therefore you see the digital playing a dividing role, a polarizing role. My question to you is Australia immune to the identity debates, the polarizations, the fake news, the misinformation, the cleavages that are carved out using the digital sword? So how do we respond to the digital in a manner that we are resilient and we prevent radicalizations and we can still build the communities that we can see on the streets, online as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Australians are really enthusiastic adopters of technology. And we see this in the statistics around Australian businesses' embrace of technological innovation. So I was, before being in Delhi, now I was in Bengaluru for the Bengaluru Tech Summit, speaking at a panel there about Australia as a place to work, study and live. And the focus of that was on the technology collaborations that we're seeing between Australia and India at the moment. Next year we'll be opening a Centre of Excellence for Critical and Emerging Technology Policy in Bengaluru, and Toby's been driving that, our cyber and critical tech ambassador. But seeing firsthand there the Australian companies that were innovating with the energy in Bengaluru, Atlassian, one of the great startups of recent years, a great collaboration platform, has an enormous office in Bengaluru. but they have a work from anywhere policy where the majority of their staff live more than 2 hours from any Atlassian office, which I thought was extraordinary because the Atlassian office in Bengaluru had a bowling machine, cricket nets. It was about the most fancy office you can imagine, but the majority of their staff still work from home, lived a long way away. So Australians love technology, we adopt it. Unfortunately, we're not immune from the kind of challenges that you're talking about. You know, when you think about the effect that the internet has had, you know, to get technical on it, it's collapsed transaction costs. Mm-hmm. It's made it easier for communities of interest, for people that share a passion in something, to find each other. Mm-hmm. And because it's collapsed transaction costs, it's made it easier for people with more niche interests to find each other and to collaborate. So whereas in the past we came together in mass mediums, mm-hmm. Through newspapers, through broadcast television, now we come together around very small niche interests. And unfortunately, a lot of the energy in those niche communities is driven by division and conflict and outright aggression at times. How do we deal with that? I think the first thing, and we've discussed this in the past, is to assert that government has a proper role mm-hmm. in regulating the rules of the road on technology and setting those norms and standards for what occurs online. You may have seen that Australia had a very direct face-off with Facebook mm-hmm. recently. Mm-hmm. You know, the previous government sought to impose regulations on Facebook, and in response, they withdrew services from the country altogether. Mm-hmm. I think what that encounter demonstrated, though, is that the sovereign power of nations still matters, mm-hmm. because Facebook came back to the table and were able to reach a sort of an agreed position. But yes, I think it is important that governments intervene to protect community cohesion and to protect you know, that group solidarity that we need as nations to survive.
And finally, before I turn to the foreign policy report, I thought I'll also ask you about China, the elephant in the Asia house. You know, how different is your government's approach to China going to be? And how is it going to implicate other partners of yours in the region, including India? What should India be thinking as you recarve or restart or perhaps reorient your engagement with China?
Well, it's no secret that the Australia-China relationship has gone through a challenging period in recent times. And while we have a new government in Australia, what hasn't changed is our underlying national interests. So what the new government has said is that you know, we will continue to disagree with China where we must, and particularly I'd say that's on issues like trade blockages, on beef, barley, wine, a range of goods that have been subjected to, we think, unjustified trade blockages by China, certain consular cases, human rights. We will continue to speak out on those issues. But we'll do that in a calm and consistent way. And while we're doing that, we'll also look for areas where we can collaborate in the national and the global interests, particularly on something like climate change. Mm-hmm. You know, China isn't going anywhere. It's still our #1 trading partner. It's still going to be a major partner in those global challenges. So we will seek to work together with China where it's in the national interest to do so. In response to this new, the new government, we have resumed talks with China. So Foreign Minister Wang has met a number of times with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and at the recent G20, Prime Minister Albanese met with Xi Jinping for the first time in some time. So we have taken initial steps in stabilising the relationship. We think it's in the interest of both sides, that relationship, to stabilise the relationship. But clearly there are many more steps that will need to come in the future.
And what should the partners be thinking?
What should partners be thinking?
About this new conversation that is started. Is this some, like for example, your relationship in the Quad? Now, is that something that is going to continue to be invested into?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I say, that Australia's national interests have not changed with the mm-hmm. change of the government. So our commitment to the Quad remains very significant. And I think equally our commitment to India as a natural partner. I think we view India as a natural partner because we think we share the same interests, share the same challenges, but particularly share the same perspectives, a shared democratic heritage. It makes mm-hmm. it a natural fit. So none of that has changed. I think I would say that partners could observe that we are talking with China again, but I would say that India has continued talking with China through this period as well, and as has Japan. So they're all, and as the United States has done at the G20. So that doesn't represent any change in underlying national interests.
Let's move to the foreign policy report that you just released, Minister Watts. By all accounts, you see Indians viewing Australia very favorably. You have had a first-hand experience in Bangalore, now in Delhi, some more in your next few days in this capital. You're right up there with Americans, with, Australia is right there as the most likely important partner in the coming decade. This is a big survey outcome, and this is something that Foreign Minister Jaishankar has spoken about in the past. We have, of course, heard others speak about this as well from your government in the past. What do you think is driving this new confidence of India in Australians? And I'm assuming there is perhaps also a significant constituency in Australia that I had the chance of experiencing in my visit, who also are far more confident of India today. So what do you think is really driving this change? What is behind this transformation? Is it real or is it digital in some sense? What is the texture of this change?
Well, look, can I first say how delighted I was when I opened that report and saw that finding. Look, I think there are a few things at play here. I think at the big picture level, both Australia and India have had to consider their strategic interests carefully over the last 10 years. And when we've considered that, again, we come back to the realisation that we are actually natural partners, share a lot of the same interests, share a lot of the same perspectives. And that's led to a lot of alignment, I think, between India and Australia at the governmental level, through groupings like the Quad, but also bilaterally. I mean, it's a genuine procession of Indian ministers to Australia recently. It's just absolutely delightful and a different environment than it was 10 years ago. So big picture, that change there. But also, I think at that granular level, the nature of the diaspora in Australia really has changed the level of interaction. And I think 10 years ago, Australians felt warmly towards India. Every time there was a tour to India, we'd love watching, maybe not love watching VVS Laxman bat and bat and bat, but it was warmth. But now I think the relationship it's intimate, it's close, it's familiar, it's firsthand. When my kids play sport on the weekends, they're playing with Indian Australians. And their best mates at school are Indian Australians. They're eating the same foods. I mean, I was in Bengaluru earlier in the week and comparing the quality of their doses with the quality that I get in Footscray, and it's the kind of familiarity that just did not exist 10 years ago. And I think that's happening on both sides of it, but it's particularly happening in the youth cohorts. They're growing up with this.
There is also another part of the survey which says that the India-Russia relationship is seen by many in India as its most important one since independence. Many in Europe in my travels find it difficult to understand. What is Australia's position on this survey finding, but more generally on the fact that many Indians have see Moscow as having been its most trusted ally for a very, very long time? How does Australia respond to this, Indian?
Oh, look, I think we understand that different countries have different cultural and historical contexts. All countries within that context will make a decision about how they respond to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen different countries make different approaches. I should say, though, that when my observations of India's response to this, I really warmly welcomed Prime Minister Modi's comments to Vladimir Putin at the SCO that, the time of war is past. I think that's a view that is shared by all young people around the world, frankly. This idea that resolving our differences through armed conflict is an idea that is best left with our grandparents' generation. It's not appropriate for our modern era. So I think that's the approach. I wasn't massively surprised by that bad outcome, but I think we understand that countries will make determinations of their own
There was another
about how to
finding which we just, the clip had, which was that a very large percentage of Indians see China as a threat. A very large percentage. In fact, some argue that they have lost a whole generation of Indians by what they did a few years ago. Now, let me ask you, how has the past few years' behavior of China vis-a-vis Australia implicated Australian thinking on China? How does the Australian street assess China today?
I was struck actually reading that section of the report by the way that it parallels similar findings that the Lowy Institute has found of Australian public opinion towards China. taken over about of a 10-year period, they have this barometer where they measure the warmth of a relationship. 10 out of 10 is a hot relationship. 0 out of 10 is freezing cold. And over a 10-year period, that China barometer ranking went from about 60 down to about 30. Mm-hmm. A very significant drop. And I think that's a function of, China has changed, become more assertive in the way that it pursues its interests and its conception of its interests. And those challenges that I talked about earlier have been noticed by the Australian population. They know that the trade blockages are unjustified. They want to see Australians treated fairly in the consular cases that we have. And they have genuine concerns about human rights issues. And those challenges have been reflected in public opinion, again, particularly amongst young people.
Another strange finding in this survey was around the Quad. Lukewarm enthusiasm for the Quad, extremely strong affinity to the Quad members. So a very strong appreciation of partnership with the US, Japan, Australia, other members of the Quad. But Quad itself trails BRICS by a fair distance, for example. Now, how is Quad as a grouping appreciated in the Australian population, and how can perhaps Quad countries make this a more sellable, more identifiable grouping for its larger population when we all have such strong bilateral relationships? Are we missing something here? Strong affinity to the country, but not to the grouping when they all come together. What's going on?
I honestly think it's just the fact that the Quad is a relatively new grouping. I mean, it was established in the wake of the tsunami, but went through a period of dormancy and has sort of only been reinvigorated in recent years. I mean, I think the underlying bilateral attitudes that you identify are a very solid foundation for public opinion towards the Quad. I mean, the way that we think about it is that the collective of the Quad is worth more than the sum of its parts, and that dealing with the geostrategic challenges that we are facing, the challenges to stability in our region, that we are better off working together than alone. I think the way that we can sheet that home to the publics in our respective nations is by delivering practical outcomes. So, the Quad needs to start delivering on the things that it's working on. I mean, in my mind, I sort of conceptualise the Quad as delivering public goods for the region, delivering on practical areas of cooperation that deal with threats to regional stability. So, the public health initiatives, the coordination on disaster response and resilience, the climate change resilience initiatives. I was recently at a counter-terrorism tabletop exercise in Sydney. When we start delivering on those specific outcomes within the Quad, I think that's when you'll see public opinion catch up with the individual warmth.
The Australians have also, just staying with the Quad, we've also seen the Australian government in the past few years invest a lot into building a Quad technology network, bringing technology as a centerpiece of the relationship. How do we, as four countries with fairly different approaches to technology, on how we deal with, the Americans have a very different approach to how they deal with their technology companies, which face off against Indian and Australian regulators in some instances. How do you make technology as a domain, as a sector, productive as a Quad offering, as a Quad public good, when it's so intellectual property heavy and companies are so reluctant to share? How do we change that? I mean, India has been trying to open up its technology space to all. Is that something that can be a Quad agenda going forward?
Oh, I think it's absolutely something that can be a Quad agenda. I mean, on the sort of technology governance and regulatory approaches issue, I think the first thing is just talking about it, talking it through, because while things on the surface can seem different in the specifics, you can find, I think, shared underlying principles beneath it, and that's what we need to sort of get to, and those shared principles of the norms of governance at the granular level. But I think more broadly, technology is an area where the complementarities between our countries have enormous potential for us to be worth more than the sum of our parts. I mean, one of the big things coming out of COVID is the need for resilient supply chains, diversified resilient supply chains. And, you look at something like, battery manufacturing, Australia's critical minerals, India's ambitions in this critical technology space, it seem ideally aligned. Quantum is an area of really significant interest to myself personally. The Sydney Quantum Academy, I think, is the best institution in the world for training quantum PhDs. And I know that India's strategy with quantum, really wanting to ramp that up. Narendra Modi's committed very significant resources to building that industry here. Need more quantum PhDs being trained as soon as possible. That's an area of complementarity where, again, I think that together we're worth more than the sum of our parts.
So, on these sectors, another area that potentially offers great opportunity, but I would argue has seen Australian absence for whatever reasons, is climate change and responding to the green transitions, the opportunities that they offer. Has Australia turned the corner? Are we going to see Australia now be an actor, stakeholder, participant, contributor?
Yes, we're back.
You're back.
I mean, yeah, climate change has had a frustrating role in the Australian political debate over the last 10 years, but I think one thing that has been central to the agenda of the new government, both from opposition through to government, is real action on climate change. So one of the first acts of the new government was to update our nationally determined contribution as part of the Paris COP process to a 43% reduction on 2005 emission levels by 2030, as well as committing to net zero by 2050. And we unveiled a very comprehensive suite of domestic measures, but also a reorientation of our official development assistance program to invest more in those climate change resilience programs overseas, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where they are acutely needed. I mean, if there's a front line of climate change, it's in the Pacific. And I can tell you that message has been received loud and clear by members of our Pacific family. They know we're serious about this, and they've welcomed our return as a credible, trusted partner on this issue.
And you hope to see this sector become particularly vital to the bilaterals as well, India and Australia?
Absolutely. I mean, as I say, like if we are going to respond to the threat of climate change effectively, we need India's manufacturing power and its technological nous to succeed. And if India's to succeed in that respect, Australian critical minerals, as well as the partnership at the technological level, the smarts level, I mean, I think we, again, worth far more together than separate.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn to all of you now, and of course I had alerted a few of you that I'm going to bring you in as others try to get my attention so that I can turn to you. But let me start with one of your fellow alumni. So my colleague from ORF, Sunena, would you like to pose a question? Can one of my colleagues get the mic to her?
Good evening. Thank you so much for your address, and it's also wonderful to hear how sensitive you are to engaging with the youth. I'm part of AIYD 2019, and I also work with the Observer Research Foundation. So my question, considering we are releasing the youth survey, and you spoke quite eloquently about engaging with the youth, my question was, the youth is of course facing multiple challenges, climate change, transformations from technology, economic uncertainty. How can we make policy making more sensitive in engaging with the youth? And also the role that an alliance like G20 can play in this?
Yeah, I mean, I often, when I talk to young people, I sort of reflect on my own experience here, and that when I was graduating high school and starting at university was around the time that The End of Certainty came out. And, as a young, politically ambitious individual, someone that wanted to make big changes in the world, The End of Certainty was a bit of a disappointing book, because it kind of, this premise that, we'd had it all worked out and that, it was open markets and liberal societies and the political class were just going to be managers from here on out, was a little bit disappointing to me. I was like, where's my Berlin Wall? Where's my great challenge? And now I look at young people today and the challenges that they face, the existential threat of climate change, the very significant threats to democracy around the world, the pervasive economic inequality and the obstacles that they need to overcome. And you might think that young people would be utterly depressed in the face of this, or paralysed or exasperated. But in my experience, it's actually the complete opposite. You know, I love talking to young people in my job because they're the least cynical people that I interact with as a politician. You know, they have a genuine belief that they can change the world, that these challenges are not insurmountable, that, you know, through the application of hard work and new thinking, that we can respond to them. So I think the most obvious answer as to how we engage with young people in these challenges is to invite them in. Because that fresh thinking, but that optimism is in short supply at the moment. We desperately need it. So I always make time for young people in my role. I always look to build institutions that are inclusive of the perspectives of young people, that enable their views to be heard, and, you know, given a platform. And I really congratulate ORF on centralising this in your work through this survey, because it will be impactful, and I think it will make change for the better.
Can I request Nayanama to pose her question now? Can I get the mic to her, please?
Hi, thank you. Minister, just my question on what you spoke today at the No Money for Terror conference, where you talked about combating terrorism at regional and international levels. So my question to you would be, now that Pakistan is out of the FATF grey list, do you think within the Quad, probably the Quad countries can have their own sort of counterterrorism measures and also checking off terror financing, things like that, because these are regional concerns? Maybe FATF is too big to look at that. Thank you. Thank you, Samir.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think that counterterrorism cooperation is a really rich potential agenda for the Quad, because it's something that we really do all agree on at a fundamental level. It's an issue that has affected all members of the Quad directly. And I observed a tabletop exercise in counterterrorism for the Quad in Sydney recently, and it was interesting watching the American, the Japanese, the Indian and the Australian actual counterterrorism operational experts observing each other, learning from each other at a really granular level. It was interesting to me because, you know, these are relationships that, you know, perhaps we're used to working bilaterally together, but the dynamic of everyone in the room together I thought was really interesting and really positive. So I think that's a really important agenda for the Quad going forward, because it's one that we start from the same starting point. And unfortunately, the threat of terror generally isn't going anywhere. You know, we're seeing different manifestations of it. You know, in Australia, we've seen a significant growth of this anti-authoritarian, anti-government, anti-everything extremism that's come in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And really stopping that from radicalising people, particularly in the online environment, is a very important agenda moving forward.
So let me just ask you a question on that. And by the way, I have time for one more question, so if someone wants. Okay, I'm going to come to you there. Oh, but so many hands. So we'll try to take two. Okay,
you can take the message from my speech and tweet at me if you like.
But just a quick question on that: how do you deal with the fact that there doesn't seem to be an agreement on what constitutes terror, right? In fact, I would argue that social media has hashtag terrorists. Everyone can use an hashtag, make their own favorite terrorist for that day, for that month, trend. How do you achieve plurilateral or multilateral consensus on action when there is no definition that you can agree on?
Well, I think you start with friends, and I think the Quad is a good starting point. I think there is a good consensus within the Quad about this, from my observations amongst the operational experts. So yeah, I think it's you start with your friends and then you expand out from that. I think the Quad can be most powerful when it's an institution that works cooperatively with existing regional institutions, and then with bilateral partners engaging with it. You know, for the Quad to succeed, it has to work closely with ASEAN, for example, and with the infrastructures there.
Thank you. So sorry, the hands again. So let me take the gentleman in blue right here, and then let me come to you, sir. We'll take two questions, and can we club them? Can we take them together? I'll try to remember them as well. Go ahead.
Sure.
Question.
Good morning, Minister. This is Yashwant. Sir, I want to understand the Western mind through you. How you're looking at the new rising India? If you want to see India to grow only up to a particular point where we can contain the Western rival China, or are you really comfortable more than that for India?
Okay, that's a good question. And let's turn to the gentleman in front. Do introduce yourself. Can we have the mic here? Mic here.
Yogesh from Tayana Software Solutions. I've come down from Bangalore as well. You gave us an interesting insight on millennials in Australia. Coming from Bangalore, you can see that that's really a melting pot of technology and tremendous change and innovations happening right there, right? Can you just give us an insight on some of the things at a policy level you would do to really get more Australian companies to collaborate and leverage this? Because as you see, there's a lot more American and other organizations from global markets, but not, it's sure there are Australian companies as well, but what do you think could be done over the next year, 2 years to engage with Australian companies to really leverage this opportunity of technology?
So I think the first question is interesting. The first question was that what is your approach, assessment on India's growing presence in world affairs? Is it nice and appreciated at 3 trillion, a little more cautious at 5, not very useful at 10? How will India's rise and size change your assessment of India?
I'd be delighted for India to reach the soaring potential that I know it has. I have no concerns or qualms or anxieties whatsoever in that respect. We really want India to carve out a role commensurate with its status on the international stage. So, UN Security Council seat, these things are, I think, an important recognition of India's status. In terms of the digital arrangements, look, there are a few things. So one, the reason that I led a delegation of 50 Australian businesses and policy makers and civil society leaders to Bengaluru for the Tech Summit was to lift the profile of the Australia-India tech relationship in Australia as well, to say this is a path where you can achieve enormous success. So going to the Atlassian office, modelling that, showing, hey, this is an amazing opportunity here, is part of it. I think as a government, we're trying to create the most hospitable environment for that bilateral cooperation. So, we've recently signed, and our parliamentary processes are endorsing the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, which was an important foundational economic agreement between our nations. Tariff reduction on 85% of Australian trade by volume. But I think the more exciting opportunity now is the next step, a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, and the focus agenda on that, digital services. So if we can get to a landing on that, I think we can really blow the doors off the hinges of Australian companies and Indian companies collaborating in the relationship.
So on the flip side, Minister, what should India be doing to make India more attractive for your investors and companies and stakeholders? What can we be doing to welcome you into the world that we are trying to build here in terms of our...
I think that the issues within this digital agreement are going to be important. So particularly issues around data treatment, ensuring that there is an ability to engage in cross-border data flows that promotes digital business, that doesn't inhibit it. There are legitimate interests that need to be protected around sovereign data. But I think there's a wide scope of potential agreement making that can facilitate that kind of cross-border trade.
So thank you very much, Minister, for engaging with us for this very honest and direct conversation on your assessment of India, the relationship, Australia's changing identity, and therefore its future directions, and most importantly, for your optimism, both in terms of the youth, which India has plenty of, and of course, your optimism around India and its engagement with the world and certainly with Australia. So let me thank you for joining us this afternoon, for coming and spending an hour with us, for releasing our report, and for, of course, your presence in the room with so many young folks who clearly are excited about the future of our relationship.